Good evening and welcome. I'm Ivan Yates, standing in for Vincent Brown. Shortly we'll be speaking to the Irish clerical abuse survivor who met with the Pope yesterday in his first television interview. Later we'll be discussing the Oireachtas Finance Committee's report into the ongoing mortgage arrears crisis, published this afternoon, with a list of 47 recommendations to solve a potentially catastrophic situation. We'll ask if any of them have merit and what's the fairest way of solving this complicated problem. Joining us for a discussion on that later will be Kieran O'Donnell, Fine Gael TD, Carl Dieter, property economist, Michael McGrath, Fianna Fáil TD, both deputies, members of the committee, and Ross Maguire of New Beginnings. Later in the programme, of course, we'll also have all the analysis of the fallout from the cancellation of all Garth Brooks concerts, along with a preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can text us at 53131 and place the word tonight before your comment. Or you can send us a tweet at #VimB or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. You can also use the Showpal app to interact with tonight's programme. Tonight our Showpal poll question asks, do you feel that the Dublin City Council decision not to sanction all the Garth Brooks concerts was justified? Yes or no? But first, yesterday history was made when Pope Francis met 6 clerical abuse survivors individually to discuss the Church's responsibility in this global scandal. But was it just a PR stunt? What was said to him and what will come of it? Now we're joined by one of the 2 Irish people who met Pope Francis yesterday, Mark Vincent Healy, and we're also joined by Patsy McGarry, Religious Affairs Correspondent with the Irish Times. Mark, you're most welcome.
Thank you.
What was it like meeting the Pope?
Nerve-wracking, actually, outside, walking, pacing up and down. I was the 4th person in to see him. So those who had gone before, I didn't want to think about what they were going through. I was trying to just manage my own space and time. So eventually I was called and I went in. I had some books with me. I had a gift of Mary Robinson, Everybody Who Matters book, which I had actually gotten signed by her. Mainly because I see her as a great human rights advocate and someone I admire greatly, and I thought to exchange.
And was it just the 2 of you?
It was myself, Pope Francis, and Cardinal O'Malley, who was part of the apostolic visitation that came to Ireland in the first place, and he's also then the president of the new commission for the protection for minors. So he was doing the translation, he was the interpreter, and it was then Spanish and English between all 3 of us.
What was the first point you made to him?
First point was telling him that this was such a serious matter. I started with the areas of crisis for survivors, which is suicide. So I told him that I was involved in a campaign to try raise further awareness of just how vulnerable survivors are, and the fact that there is very little research that has been conducted to date to look into how high suicide rates are, what are the contributing factors and how they could be alleviated. I attended a conference at World Suicide Prevention Day of last year.
Did you tell him about your own abuse in St Mary's College with Father Maloney?
I did. And I got, basically I came on to that, but that was actually part 3 of, I did a 3-part thing. But when I got into that, yes, I did. I talked first about the first abuser, which was Arthur Carraher. So I dealt first with Father Arthur Carraher, and then I dealt with Father Henry Maloney. Now, Father Henry Maloney was convicted then in the 19th of March 2009 in a conjoined case between myself and Paul Daly.
Talk to us about Paul.
Paul, he was about 3 years ahead of me actually in school. It was the first time to actually meet him was actually through that case, because it was I hadn't been aware of Paul being involved actually up to that point. His case was dealt with separately. It was then that the judicial system, in terms of the criminal prosecution, brought the 2 cases together at that one point, and that's when I met him first. And I heard obviously all of his story through the court case and proceedings. He was an incredibly bright, very capable man. His working life seemed to be very full. He had a job with the UN.
But it was all too much for him.
He had his moments when he was finding great difficulty coping with his own abuse, which led to, I suppose, a lot of self-abuse, and that caused a lot of problems, obviously, for himself and difficulties for the relationships with his own family. But I don't really want to speak too much about that personal stuff.
He took his own life. Did that, as you were relaying these stories, and you were relaying the consequences of abuse for survivors in terms of mental ill health, 6 times higher rates of suicide, the economic impact. I've read through some of the data. How did the Pope respond?
To the suicide of Paul?
To everything.
Well, to the suicide of Paul, he winced. He actually, winced is the wrong word. He responded as someone who was wounded by hearing it. I find the Pope is actually very sincere, very genuine in what he is attempting to do. He is setting out to try make a difference and to change. The response that the Church has appallingly, let's say, done to date, they haven't really been very helpful, supportive. In fact, they have done everything to frustrate justice for survivors, I think, and they've actually contributed greatly then as well to instances of suicide. So
you made the point that you believe there's been really significant underreporting of abuse cases. Did you make that point to the Pope?
I did. And again, he was... well, actually, I think he was very shocked at that point, because he was shocked at 2 points. He was shocked at the low prosecution rates, which was sort of like 94%. So you have to take 94% failed, 6% of cases that are brought forward were successfully prosecuted according to the national audit figures. So, but that 100% is only 5% of maybe the total number of people abused. So on 2 counts, he was actually shocked. He was shocked to find out that 94% of priests actually sort of like are not held to any account.
They're not convicted.
They're not convicted because of this zero tolerance issue with him. He has this aspect to it.
Okay, Patsy McGarry, you can put this in context for us. We were just discussing earlier, only cardinals get 30 minutes with the Pope. Mark took 45 minutes in a private audience. Just how significant do you regard this meeting? And give us some context to what happened yesterday.
Well, Ivan, it is, I think, hugely significant. It's a new papacy. He has already set up this Commission for the Protection of Minors. They had their first meeting in May. It includes 4 men, 4 women, including Marie Collins, who was herself abused by a priest in this Dublin Archdiocese. There's now talk of extending it to include people who were abused or representative of Asia, South America, whatever. In other words, to extend its membership. It is creating its own terms of reference. It is to be hoped that it will be very stringent, but that's aspirational. About yesterday, I think yesterday was enormously significant, because it is the first time that this man has had direct dealings with people who've been abused. He was for 3 hours and 20 minutes yesterday listening to 6 people, one of whom was Mark, recounting their horrific stories, not only of the abuse, but of the consequences for them personally of that abuse, and how the Church added to that by the way it mishandled it. I tried to frustrate the stories coming out in the first place, sending in lawyers rather than therapists or counsellors or whatever to deal with these people. And I do believe that, being the man he is, and from what Mark says and what Marie Kane said yesterday to me as well, that he has listened sincerely and taken on board sincerely what these people have said.
Just to explain to us how utterly reprehensible was the way the Spirit and Fathers, the Holy Ghost Fathers, moved around these problem priests.
Well, a lot of this came out through Mark's own work. I mean, Mark himself, after Henry Leone case was dealt with in 2009, He's now in Cambridge Manor. He's out of ministry. He had been convicted in 2000 of abusing 2 other boys in St Mary's College. Mark himself did some research about Henry Maloney's previous history. He had been moved to Africa in another case. He'd been moved to Rockwell College, if I recall correctly, as well, when there were other allegations against him. He talked about Arthur Callagher, who was accused of abusing Mark as well. He was moved to Canada. Ireland doesn't have an extradition treaty with Canada, so he couldn't be brought back for trial. So
effectively they protected them.
Worse, they moved them around.
To open it up for further abuse.
Thanks to the work that Mark did. The National Board for Safeguarding Children, the Catholic Church's own watchdog, did an investigation of the Spiritans, one of the very first congregations to be investigated, and it found that they had moved 47 men around schools in Ireland. Now we're talking about, I mean, Blackrock College, St Mary's College, Timpalogue College, Rockwell College in Tipperary. I mean, which would be, people would be quite shocked at that sort of behaviour at that level. I'm not saying it's tolerable at any level, sure. But that's what happened, and that was in many ways thanks to his work.
Mark, what would you like to see come out of this in terms of the next steps?
The next steps have to be a translation into actions. There have to be a series of concrete proposals put forward to assist and alleviate the distresses caused to survivors. They haven't really come up with any methods of doing that. There's been a series of, in Ireland we'll say, there's been mental health services through Towards Healing. Ashling has done something as well then with regards to like educational services to those who needed and required it. There was an addition, I think, in Towards Healing as well for sort of like housing, so that was another issue. But outside of that... Compensation? Well, compensation has been derisory, I think, in this jurisdiction. Again, capping was an issue that I raised with Pope Francis. I don't think the capping works. 300,000 is an estimate of someone's worth or life with regards to the consequences of clerical child sexual abuse. Up till more recently, I think the consequences were seen that they could be salved by something like 20, 40, 60 weeks of therapy, and you'll be fine, like, and you're dressed away with you. It's only more recently that even the Pope himself has come back and said, no, this is a lifelong condition, and he's accepting that now. So that's been a big change. It's also in his speech of yesterday, or speech I should say, his homily of yesterday, he recognised the difficulties in terms of relationships that people experience, that the breakup of marriage, of the difficulties then faced as a result of that. Addiction he mentioned as well. So again, there were many things that were on my list of actions for him to recognise first with regards to what the problems are, to then come up with concrete solutions.
Could I put it to you, and this may seem a very cynical question to you, but that the Pope is so long in the Church, you know, where was he that he didn't hear of all this? I mean, it's not new. Do you think this was a PR exercise?
No, I don't. I genuinely don't think this was a PR exercise. I did listen to Father Federico Lombardi afterwards as well, and he was asked the same question and he flatly denied it, but then maybe you'd expect the PR man for the Vatican to say that. But having met him and those there, my sense was, no, there is a sincere effort. They're sweating it out. They're really wanting to see a change, and I think the current Pope is very insistent on seeing that. The fact that he was so visibly hurt listening to stories, listening to the hurt that survivors go through.
But will that compassion, Patsy, will that compassion be translated into concrete measures? Only
time will tell, Ivan. And just to make a point, Mark talked about a cap not being a good idea on amounts of money. It might give the impression that they want more money, but that is not the instance. In fact, money, as has been found out through the experience of people who got lots of money from the redress board, can often be huge amounts of it, hugely damaging for people who are addicted, whether it be to alcohol or drugs or whatever, and indeed many of them have had early deaths as a result. I think the government, our own government, has been much more clever with dealing with the Magdalene women. They gave them a certain amount and then a regular income for life, plus services to do with counselling, healing, housing, and free medical cards, that sort of thing, because this is a lifelong business, as Mark says.
Finally, Mark Vincent, do you hope to meet him again?
Oh, it would be a pleasure, absolute pleasure. It was a joy to meet him. I didn't think that I would feel like that having met him, or before meeting him. I was dreading the actual experience because I thought that sort of like maybe I've I've been invited into a space that I'm not capable really of measuring up to, but I felt, in fact, it was the other way around. I felt he put me at my ease, but I was actually at ease with him. I really did run, what's the expression, sort of like, you know, hit the ground running. That's exactly how I felt once I got in there. I thought I would be choked talking to the man, and I wasn't.
I have no surprise you weren't choked. Mark, Vincent Healy, we wish you well.
Thank you very much.
And in all your campaigns, and we certainly hope that something comes of it. Patsy McGarry, thank you also. After the break, we'll discuss the mortgage arrears crisis and ask if all the heads in the Oireachtas Finance Committee were able to come up with any realistic solutions. Join us then.